Now, human trafficking continues to be a big challenge in South Africa. There have been increasing calls for government to intervene or do more. Advocacy groups claim that the crime is now rife. Statistics show that 23% of children who go missing are apparently never found. Sex workers also continue to be the subject or victim of human rights violations and gender-based violence. Now, earlier this week, government and stakeholders held a sex worker dialogue, and that reviewed progress on the implementation of the sex worker strategy 2016-2019 and then discuss the 2019-2022 plan. Among the participants were SINAC, UNFPA, UNAIDS and sex worker advocacy groups. Now, on today's special discussion, the panel, we're going to be unpacking human trafficking in the country. We are joined by the Deputy Justice Minister, John Jeffrey, A21 SA head, that's Katie Modrao. A21 is a global NGO that's fighting modern-day slavery. UNISA police practice lecturer and researcher, that's myself and Vat, and Katlego Rasibitse from Advocacy Group C Sonke. Deputy Minister, welcome, and also welcome to all our other guests this morning, Katie, Marcel, and Katlego as well with us here in the studio. Deputy Minister, first up, we started this discussion setting the scene by just trying to understand the facts around human trafficking, considering the amount of emotive information that has been circulating on social media recently, including even some prominent personalities. From government's perspective, can we just ask first up a general question? How bad is human trafficking in South Africa today?
Look, that's a difficult question to answer because, as you've said, or as has been said already, I think that it's difficult to get the exact stats of what is happening. In terms of the numbers of cases, there were, I think, 71 accused in the from April to December last year in trafficking matters. Which is quite low, and so the number of cases actually coming forward are low. What I would want to say, though, is that trafficking is a very serious crime. I mean, for somebody to be trafficked, to be forced to do things against their will is modern slavery, so I would agree with that. And we need to, though, ensure that all trafficking cases are investigated and that the people responsible are brought to book. But it is important for people to report the facts, not to hype on the issue, not to come with wild allegations. We've seen it on social media. I think there was an issue of a abduction at Boulders in Midrand, which was denied as anything to do with kidnapping or trafficking. It's easy to sensationalize these issues.
Now, would you consider human trafficking to be a problem in South Africa, Deputy Minister?
Because we don't have the situation we're in is that the numbers that are reported are low, as I said. Yet there's a public perception out there that trafficking is very serious. We've got to get to grips, and so that is the problem as I would see it. Either the perception is wrong or the perception is right. If it's right, it's a very serious problem, and we need to do more. If the perception is wrong, then that's also a problem. So that's the issue. As I would want to put it.
Now, why is government?
And that's why I keep stressing report cases.
But it doesn't seem the public is reporting the cases. Why do you think would that be?
That's a good question. I mean, maybe I think your other panelists can speak about that. Obviously, there's a lot of fear involved. Look, when it comes to things like the alleged trafficking of children, of child abductions, yes, the rate that you said is very high of children that are not traced. If a child disappears, it doesn't necessarily mean they've been trafficked, but those cases would obviously come out. People that have trafficked in the sex work industry, I think, may be reluctant to report or may be afraid to report. And remember the definition of trafficking is quite broad. It includes things like debt bondage, where you're not physically held prisoner, but you're basically forced to repay a debt that you owe, and that is a form of trafficking. So yes, there would be problems of people not wanting to report, people being afraid, maybe people who've been brought in from other countries who have really no idea of where to go to. So that would also cause underreporting.
Okay, now in terms of statistics, because I was going to ask the question, and I alluded to it in my introduction when we began this discussion, that trafficking is apparently on the rise in South Africa. But based on what? Because we don't have the statistics. Why is government still struggling to get it right, you think, in terms of these statistics?
Well, it really is a problem of a lack of reporting. I mean, you obviously can't detect a crime if it's not been reported. So we have, since the implementation of the Prevention and Combating of Trafficking Act a few years ago, we have set up a national coordinating structure between government and civil society to look at human trafficking. We have taken a lot of steps. We are trying to work very closely with civil society organizations. We are trying to take steps to ensure better reporting and better recording of trafficking. We've broadened the definition of trafficking to include labor trafficking. That is something that's new. Child trafficking and trafficking for sexual purposes were crimes before the Act came into effect. But those are some of the steps we're trying to take. But it's difficult to record things if they're not reported.
Yeah, I guess that's sensible. But we're going to come later on, before we conclude this discussion on today, here is what do we think should change, what should be done. But can I bring you, Mark van der Walt from UNISA? You are a lecturer in police practice. You are a researcher. You also, Marcel, van der Walt, I called you Mark, I apologize. And you get involved sometimes with investigations. In your experience, are those investigations being done properly, or are they being undermined somewhat? Hence, we are not getting a handle on the scale and the depth of human trafficking in our country.
Yeah, good morning. So I heard some of your questions posed to Deputy Minister John Jeffrey. I just couldn't hear the responses there. But the first thing I think we need to say unequivocally, it shouldn't be hard to acknowledge that human trafficking is fundamentally an intractable and systemic problem in South Africa. It's always been. It's been there for time immemorial. It's not a problem that just suddenly started a few years ago when our legislation became operational. So I think, and most countries in the world will acknowledge it. And I think if you think about South Africa, the structural inequalities, I think we've got a perfect climate for the crime. Do we have the statistics? Absolutely not. But there's a number of problems that goes along with that. And I heard that you've got Sweat on board this morning as well. The problem is, where it comes to, it's multi-layered, but the problem is even in research, we are still using, some researchers are fundamentally using a truncated definition of trafficking. I'm going to go, as I heard you at Africa Check online this morning, and frankly, they've got it wrong far too many times. You can just go onto their website at this very moment and you look at their human trafficking fact sheet, which basically states that the definition is not yet operational. We're talking about the trafficking in persons definition that became operational on the 9th of August 2015. Their fact sheet says it's not even operational. Furthermore, even Africa Check has truncated the definition, alluding that the movement element is a prerequisite for trafficking to occur. The problem is people do not have to be moved to be trafficked. So the point what I'm trying to make is even our researchers are fundamentally truncating the definition. They're undercounting the problem. Then the other thing that we're dealing with in terms of reporting is a huge problem. Katie is online this morning. Katie can elaborate on how many cases over how many years have been reported to authorities. Either there's no feedback or there's no investigations, or some trafficking cases still become subsumed under a host of other crimes. So the first time I started dealing with this issue as far back as 2002 was with the Hawks. I investigated these issues. And providing testimony as far back as 2009 about syndicates operating nationally. The problem we face in South Africa, unfortunately, human trafficking is predisposed to sensationalist and unsubstantiated narratives, which is a problem. But in tandem with that, we cannot dismiss or placate this issue. It's just, unfortunately, so part of society. And if you think about the predisposing factors, it's just such a convenient location to exploit people. And if you look at the convictions in our courts, in which I often provide testimony, I'm on my way to provide testimony in 2 more cases. If you understand how complex and the testimony of these witnesses, you realize that some of these places of exploitation, for arguments like hypothetically brothels, where people have been trafficked, women and children, has been in operation for 10, 12, 13 years before police intervention occurred. And then at the end of the day, you've got one victim being rescued, that case going to court. But we forget how the larger system of exploitation, not just sex trafficking, labor, illegal mining, etc. And then you realize, when you really sincerely, that's the key word, if you sincerely look at available evidence, I mean, police statistics just in a 28-month period between the 9th of August 2015 and the 12th of December 2017, in a 28-month period, 2,132 cases being reported. And that's just one layer of a number of other evidences that we do actually have. We can't dismiss the issue. We need to dismiss and address the unsubstantiated panic out there, but we also need to come to the table and realize we are sitting with an intractable systemic problem, and if we want to address it, we're going to have to come up with a systemic response.
We have to come up with a systemic response, and that's what we're going to discuss that later on, to say, how do we address this? As you say, it's a systemic issue and it's complex. The minister, you said, the deputy minister, you didn't hear very clearly. He mentioned that last year there was 71 accused cases that came up, 71 accused people of human trafficking that came up, and he said there's a lot of underreporting. People don't report because there's a lot of factors, including fear of reporting. Katie, Marcel mentioned you. Let me bring you in now from this global A21 thing. South Africa has been described, from what I've seen in some reports, as a source, transit and destination country for victims of trafficking. You are a global NGO, that A21. You represent this global organization here in South Africa. Are we a source, transit and destination country?
Yes, I can definitely say that that is the case. Marcel spoke quite a lot about the systemic factors that make South Africans highly vulnerable to being victims of trafficking. And often we can miss that or forget that it's not just others coming into our country being exploited, but the vulnerability rate in South Africa is 54%. So our countrymen are very vulnerable to being trafficked. If you look at...
Sorry, Katie, sorry, what do you mean the vulnerability in South Africa is 54% for being trafficked?
Yes, so falling prey to trafficking, that is a statistic and estimation by the Global Slavery Index, and they do an estimation based on individual and systemic vulnerabilities that you see within a country. And some of those systemic vulnerabilities include government response, levels of corruption, the GDP, lack of education, access to water. So they look at all the factors that could make it easy for a crime like trafficking to actually flourish within a country. So that is their estimation of vulnerability. So when you look at that, you can see that obviously, yes, South Africans do fall prey. So we are a source country. If you look at the porous nature of our borders, our sea borders and our land borders, it makes sense that we are a transit country. It's easy to move other African victims from African nations through South Africa before going to Europe or other places. We ourselves have dealt with cases like this before. And then a final destination, yes, we do have exploitation happening in South Africa of South Africans, but also of foreign nationals who are brought into our country.
Now, I've got Katlego Rasibitse in the studio with me. Katlego, welcome as well, from Sisonke National Sex Workers Movement in the country. I mean, we've had comment that comes through around one of the aspects of human trafficking shows that girls are more likely to be trafficked for sexual exploitation. On the ground in South Africa, in terms of it as a destination for that exploitative nature of human trafficking for women, what have you found?
As the movement, we need to sort out this, because human trafficking, basically, it's problematic in South Africa. But every time when we, as the country, discuss human trafficking, we bring sex work into it. And remember, not all sex workers are trafficked. You might find that,
and not all people who are trafficked end up into sex work, as we heard from Marcel there. Some of them end up in illegal mining activities.
You find lots of women are being trafficked into sex slavery, which is quite happening, and we need also to also discuss around it. Like, I'll make an example. For the fact that sex work is still criminalized in South Africa, if the police were to do a raid, it happened in Mpumalanga, 50 sex workers, to avoid arrest, they rather say we are trafficked. Then they know that upon arrival at the police station, they wouldn't be charged around Sexual Offences Act. So this is a quite behavior that you see it happening in South Africa, where if the police are raiding a particular brothel or a house, then sex workers on themselves, they will discuss among themselves to say, rather admit that we were doing sex work, let's settle to say we are trafficked. Of which you find it now, for them, they wouldn't be even be charged, because of now the government will take the whole thing as now a trafficked case.
When it is not.
When it's not.
Okay, so it's a complex picture. Thank you, Kathleen. We'll continue our discussion here on this complex human trafficking thing in the next segment of discussion. I just want us to get into the law side of things. We have a law that has been in place and since 2013, the Prevention and Combating of Trafficking in Persons of 2013, which at the time was described as one of the most progressive pieces of legislation to deal with human trafficking. So legally, are we having the right tools in place? Are we implementing them correctly? Can we just rely on the law for us to deal with the scourge of human trafficking? Stay with us.